Welcome to Mr. Strawman, and if you're thinking about working as a driver for a taxi service to make some money, think twice. My taxi app keeps matching me with a passenger in an empty field. I'd been driving for rideshare long enough to know which fares to avoid. Drunk university students on Friday nights were the worst, piling into my backseat, begging me to squeeze in, their barely conscious friends who were already losing their dinner on the curb beside my tires. So when a pickup notification appeared showing a location deep in the countryside, I hit accept without a second thought. Anything to escape the city chaos. The relief lasted about as long as those glowing urban lights stayed visible in my mirror. Once they vanished, something else crept in, an unease I couldn't quite name. The road stretched ahead with no other headlights in either direction, and my sat-nav was guiding me somewhere that felt increasingly wrong. About 100 meters from the marked location, it was like someone grabbed me by the shoulders and screamed that I'd made a terrible mistake. There were no streetlights, no buildings, no movement of any kind, just my headlamps cutting weakly into an absolute, indifferent darkness. It was a field, completely barren, no grass, no crops, no farm equipment, no animals, nothing. I pulled directly onto the pickup marker and sat there, fingers drumming the steering wheel, radio murmuring softly, waiting. Then the rear passenger door swung open on its own. The seat groaned. The entire car shifted noticeably under a sudden new weight, and the door slammed shut. I turned around. A young woman sat in the back seat. She wore a floral patterned skirt and a thick knitted jumper. At first glance, she looked perfectly ordinary, but her eyes stopped me cold. They were far too large for her face, almost as if the sockets themselves had been gradually forced wider, stretching the surrounding skin into something not quite right. If I were in his shoes, I wouldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. But if I were sitting in his seat, she'd be the one to be afraid. In the dim glow of my phone screen, her pupils appeared to swallow almost the entire visible surface of each eye. She must have registered my alarm because she smiled, a slow, thin-lipped expression, and gave a small nod as if to say, "Drive." She said nothing the whole journey, not when I asked whether she was happy with the radio station, not when I glanced at her through the mirror. She simply stared directly back at my reflection, smiling. Her destination turned out to be an abandoned retail park on the edge of town. Shuttered shops, boarded windows, not a soul in sight. I pulled up, wished her a good evening, and watched her climb out calmly and stand there observing me as I drove away. That night, I went straight home, thoroughly unsettled. The following morning, however, my app showed a tip notification. Maya tipped £50. The actual fare had been barely £12. I genuinely could not believe it. Rent covered, just like that. So the next time her request came through, I accepted, and the time after that, same pickup field, same abandoned retail park, same routine. 3 times a week like clockwork, and each time a £50 tip waiting for me by morning. I grew comfortable with her strangeness, the enormous eyes, the silence, the unsettling smile. It all just became background noise, another regular passenger. He may try to reassure himself with whatever he can, but as a rule, any attempt to sugarcoat reality eventually stops working. Then, one evening, she didn't sit behind me. She sat in the front. She had turned her whole body to face me directly, eyes completely unblinking. I greeted her as usual and was just about to pull away when something on her jumper caught the light. A small rectangular name tag, the kind worn in offices or care homes. It read Helen. Without really thinking, I asked, "Should I call you Maya or Helen?" and gestured toward the tag. She stopped smiling. The silence that followed was suffocating. She stared at me with those hollow, depthless eyes for what felt like several long minutes. Then her mouth opened. Not naturally, not from the center outward, but beginning at both corners simultaneously, peeling apart like a seam coming undone, stretching far wider than any human jaw should allow. The interior of her mouth was completely empty. No teeth, no tongue, no visible tissue at all. Just pure, solid darkness, as if her face were simply a shell with nothing behind it. A bubble formed slowly between her lips, then popped as a single word forced its way out in a strange, crackling, high-pitched tone. Helen. The mouth snapped shut. The smile returned. I drove faster than I probably should have. My palms were soaking, my right leg trembling against the accelerator. I focused entirely on the drop-off point. Just get her there. Just get her out. But rounding a bend near the tree line, a large deer launched itself across the road directly into my bonnet, bouncing away and leaving a long, dark streak glistening across the tarmac. I sat frozen, staring ahead. Then my phone chimed. Ride canceled. The passenger door opened quietly. Helen stepped out, walked steadily toward the motionless deer, then paused and turned back to give me a slow, unhurried wave. Next morning, a 100-pound tip and a message reading, "Until next time." I genuinely do not know what to do. The following story will serve as a good lesson for anyone who decides to take a shortcut to get a customer to their destination faster. I took an Uber home at midnight. 2 days later, I'm still in the car. My car had broken down without warning, leaving me no choice but to book a rideshare. For the first time in my life, it was past midnight, and public transport had long since stopped running in my direction. After some reluctant tapping on my phone screen, I found a driver ready to take me on the hour-long trip home. A few minutes later, a dark blue sedan pulled up beside me. "What's your name?" the driver called out as I checked his plate number. "Daniel," I replied, keeping my tone flat enough to discourage conversation. "I'm Ryan," he said, apparently reading the room. I climbed in and we set off. He had a GPS unit mounted on the dash, and it guided us smoothly enough at first. When he asked about taking a shortcut, I barely registered the question and mumbled something that apparently counted as approval. I was far too exhausted to care. The seat was comfortable, the heating was on, and the hum of the engine filled the silence between us like white noise. The streetlights strobed rhythmically through the windows, and the hypnotic pattern pulled me under before I could resist. The last thing I noticed before losing consciousness was a street sign drifting past in the darkness, Harrow Lane. When I woke, we were still moving, crawling down a long, unbroken road. I glanced toward the dashboard and noticed the clock had stopped working entirely, not frozen on a time, simply blank, as though it had never existed. "Sorry, I must have drifted off. Are we close?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep. Silence. "Hello? Ryan?" Nothing. I leaned forward to tap him on the shoulder and caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face had gone the color of chalk. Sweat was beading at his temples, and his eyes were stretched wide with unmistakable terror. Both hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The taxi driver clearly isn't happy with his decision to take this fare. Could he have realized where they ended up? "Ryan, what is going on?" "Don't look at them," he breathed, barely above a whisper. "Look at what—" I stopped. As my eyes adjusted fully to the dark, the street outside came into focus. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary residential neighborhood, the kind you pass through without a second thought. But something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Every single house was identical, the same peeling gray paint, the same boards nailed over every window, the same cracked concrete paths leading to the same dark front doors. There was no variation whatsoever, as though someone had copied and pasted the same building endlessly in both directions. And in front of each one, small clusters of figures stood completely motionless, watching us as we passed, hollow-cheeked, thin to the point of frailty, dressed in clothes that seemed to belong to no particular era. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they simply stared. "Don't look at them," Ryan repeated. "How long have I been asleep?" "Over an hour. There were only a handful of them when this started. Every time one of us looks directly at them, there are more." I stopped counting after the first 30 minutes. "Where exactly are we?" "The GPS sent me down Harrow Lane, and it simply doesn't end. I've been driving for over an hour, and the road keeps going. I turned around at one point, tried to go back the way I came, but the exit was just gone, like it had been erased, and there's no phone signal either." I checked my own phone immediately. He was right, not a single bar. "What do we do?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "We're going to run out of fuel within a couple of hours." The further we drove, the darker it became. The streetlights grew dimmer one by one until they gave out entirely, leaving only our headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the black. The figures were harder to see now, but somehow that made it worse. We would catch sudden glimpses of hollow faces just beyond the beam, expressions vacant and patient. And each time we did, the crowd had grown larger. They were multiplying without sound, without movement, as though they simply willed themselves into existence the moment our eyes found them. I tried not to look. It became the hardest thing I had ever done. When the engine finally began to splutter, it felt almost inevitable, like the last page of a book you never wanted to finish. The car rolled to a slow, defeated stop. My last attempt at finding a signal turned up nothing. Situations like this always seem hopeless. One way or another, they really have no chance of getting out of there. Almost immediately, the figures began to close in, forming a silent ring around the vehicle. They didn't rush. They simply stood there, waiting with the patience of something that has no concept of time. "We run for it," Ryan said. "There are too many of them between us and the darkness behind the houses. We'd never get through. I can't just sit here. I have to try." He unlocked his door and threw himself outside, and the moment his feet touched the ground, he stopped. Every trace of urgency drained out of him in an instant, as though someone had pulled a plug. He turned slowly, walked calmly to join the surrounding crowd, and took his place among them without hesitation. When he turned to face the car again, his expression was completely empty, wiped clean of everything that had made him a person. He hasn't blinked since. That was 2 days ago. The car battery died not long after. I have been sitting in total darkness for what feels like an eternity, with no way to measure time and no sound except my own breathing. The sun has not risen once. No birds, no wind, no distant traffic. Wherever this place is, it exists entirely outside the world I came from, operating by rules I don't understand and was never meant to encounter. My phone is almost out of power. I have saved it carefully, using it only in short bursts for light and to write this down. Ryan is still out there, standing motionless among the others. Occasionally, when I press my face against the glass, I can make out his silhouette in the dark. He faces the car, always the car. When the screen goes dark for the last time, I intend to open the door and step outside. I don't see any other option. If you are reading this, please find out what happened to us. Find out what Harrow Lane is and make sure no one is ever directed down it again. It was Mr. Strawman, And remember, some stories follow you home.